Here today in the Tier 6 Japanese carrier, the Ryūjō, historically a light carrier repurposed from a civilian ship hull. She's the Japanese Tech Tree Tier 6, and we're here on the map Ring in a 5s and 6 game. So, going back a little bit for some missions, and to check out some of the beginner lines, this is essentially the first real carrier in the Japanese line. She has the standard 3 squadrons of rockets, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers, and she has the infamous A6M20, the Pearl Harbor 0, and the B5N Val. Wait, actually I think the Val might be the IJN. However, but she has the B5N, also the torpedo bomber used at Pearl Harbor. Her dive bombers, however, are the Yokosuka D4Y, a bit of a later war carrier-borne dive bomber. Nevertheless, starting off, we're in tiers 5 and 6s, so I don't need to be too careful with my planes. In terms of matchmaking, the only real scary ships are maybe the New Mexico. Everything else is pretty tame. Not too much in the way of AA. This Perf, for example, is essentially AA list for all intents and purposes. It's going to use the Zero's rockets. So as you can see, they get quite narrow. It's a 2x4 setup. So that is 8 total in a squadron and 4 attacks of 2. Similar to the Kaga's A6M5s, the Tier 7 late war 0, or mid-war I suppose. Again, like the Kaga, the reticle does get quite narrow so long as you let it. You do need to give a bit of lead time. It's not the most quick of planes, but it's not awful. Can I dodge that flak? Apparently not. Fortunately for me though, it doesn't seem to be doing too much damage. I'm gonna harass that Igla. Hit with one rocket. Planes are probably a bit too unhealthy for me to continue. I'm gonna recall. Recalling, I'm gonna just launch my torpedo bombers. So, oh yes, it's the Kate, so the Val is the dive bomber. Anyhow, the B5N Kate, the infamous B5N Kate, which was used for the vast majority of the war. If you see here, their model's actually quite detailed. You can see that the torpedo is actually staggered slightly off-center, and this was because it was done this way in order to balance the weight on the airplane, essentially. So the torpedo bombers themselves, squadron of 6, 2 per attack flight, and you have a torpedo with an alpha of 6,500, does 55 knots. So, pretty fast-moving Japanese torpedo. Has the same pretty lengthy arming time, but the reticle gets nice and narrow, and the torpedoes are fast. So I'm just gonna swoop in and attack the Elba there. Oh, looks like the fighter did arm on us, so we are going to abort mission. See if we can drop these off. Alright, those are not going to hit. Anyhow, we did get 2 torpedo hits on that Alba, and he took a substantial amount of damage, as you saw. 6,500 alpha on each torpedo is nothing to scoff at. We're going to follow up and try and root him out. Oh, he died, never mind. Well, we were going to root him out with the D4Ys. So this is the early model Susei. Similar to the Suseis seen on the Kaga as well. Again, it's a smaller squadron, only 6. And its attack flights of 2, as you can see from each notch. Carries an AP bomb with a maximum damage of 6,100, which means that you have a 1,200 alpha per wave. A substantial downgrade over the 22,000 of the Shokaku, mainly because actually you're missing a bomb, not because of the quality of the bomb itself. The bomb, in comparison, does do 1,100 less. It's a lighter bomb. It's still an armor-piercing bomb, but it's a lighter one. I'm gonna have to give some lead. Not exactly a great lineup there. Alright, not the results necessarily we want to demonstrate, but let's go for that Ismail. He should line up quite nicely for us. The bomb itself is a standard AP bomb, so just line her up over the targets who you know are susceptible, Russian battleships being one of them, and you get some pretty decent results. These guys are flying over AA. If I can get over the mountain, however, I might be able to save the orange health plane, and so we do. Nice. Just recall over there. How are my squadron reserves looking? So still pretty full up. In that case, I'm going to proceed to use my torpedo bombers. So, in terms of setup, all her armaments are pretty good. The rockets are kind of mediocre, but they have their uses. They do about the same as the Kaga rockets, that is to say, they're kind of bad, to be frank. Except, because she's a tier 6 carrier, the matchmaking is much easier, so these kind of bad rockets that hit for between, let's say, 1500 to 4000 actually hit very hard. When you hit a DD for 3000 in this kind of matchmaking, for example, it's something like 25% of their total health. Maybe even more, so. The rockets are fine in this matchmaking. As an overall package weapon system, they're pretty middling, but it looks like I overled. You'll notice here that the torpedo bombers don't have a heal yet, and that's because I am using a tier 6 carrier, so you just simply don't have access to those kinds of consumables yet. So I'm going to hit 1 here on the nose. That's alright. The Ryūjō's fighter bomber, or fighter, has tagged us, but we're going to just launch this if we can get it into the water, and maybe I can get it to hit, but I'm not holding my breath. But anyhow, the torpedoes are the most consistent weapon, as I was saying. You have deep-ish reserves. 9 is not good, but not bad. Same goes for the dive bombers, but the problem I have with the dive bombers is similar to the Rangers' problems compared to the Lexington. The low number of bombs means that you don't have a great density of payload. And so without high density, you can't really guarantee that you're going to get good bomb hits every time. On battleships, it's not too bad, but when you're striking something like a cruiser-sized target like this Perf, for example, which is completely stationary, I cannot guarantee that I'm necessarily going to hit him, just because I only have 2 bombs. And so you saw there they dispersed pretty nicely within the ellipse, but they were both at the rear, which means they kind of didn't hit the citadel, which meant that he avoided most of the damage. I'm going to force him out of the cap here. I'm jamming down on the air brake to try and slow down. That was a pretty good lucky hit there. Double citadel for 1200, or 12,000, sorry. And you can see here the Perf AA is essentially non-existent, just a couple of machine guns chipping away. The planes themselves are squishy, but they're quite fast for a low tier plane. Without boosting here, I'm doing some 150 odd knots. Gonna lead here. No, not quite. Some splash, but I did force him from the cap, which is my main objective. So we know there's a GD in D, the Igla, so I'm going to scout it out for my team because they're huddling in fear. And at this point, we've secured firm control of AC. I know the Farragut is contesting AC, but it's not a huge issue. I'm going to fly over to that cluster of allied ships beneath D, provide some spotting and also provide some air cover, and then if I cannot find the Igla, I will likely harass that La Galissonière. So Igla was last seen over here, just gonna put an interceptor. If I was an Igla, okay, he's smoking now, so there's no question as to where he is. The question now is what angle he would approach at, and okay, he's also answered that question for us. So he's right here, and he's kind of lengthwise this way. However, this Legal is offering a nice target, so I'm gonna actually divert my attention to him for just a little bit. He's popped his defensive fire, you can see from the hot orange in the flak. That's fine. Alright, he's been finished off. And the Igla is being spotted by, I assume, Leon or Hydro. So I'm gonna lead him, and I can see which way his nose is pointed, in spite of not being able to see him very clearly on my screen from the minimap. So I'm gonna lead him like so. And let's see if we're on point. Oh, he beached himself. So if he kept proceeding, he would have taken the torpedo, but he did beach and then reverse. But that's fine. That kind of thing happens. New Mexico. So I still have a full squadron of torpedo bombers to launch, so that is what we will launch. I want to keep cycling through my reserves. As you know, planes don't regen when they're full up, so these fighters have not been topping up, but we haven't been needing them, so that's fine. So if I did not have a full squadron of torpedo bombers back yet, I probably would have just launched the AP dive bombers. The AP dive bombers, as I demonstrated, they're perfectly serviceable. They do the job. Not exactly the world enders of the Shokaku or Enterprise, but it's a tier 6 carrier. What can you expect? Tier 6 carriers, they lack a bit of carry power compared to their tier 8 counterparts. Even when you're top tier like this, while you are potent, just because of the low payload counts, you don't do a lot of damage at once unless you get dots on battleships, but you don't always want to be aiming at battleships, obviously. So you don't always get huge damage numbers. Usually you're looking at more middling damage numbers in the 60s and 70s. There I tagged the Ryūjō fighter because I got a bit too close to him. Well, that's fine. We still have plenty of torpedo bombers in reserve. 7 after those land. So those are effectively expendable. I'm gonna go dive bombers against New Mexico. New Mexico has a citadel. The only ships I wouldn't go after in this kind of matchmaking are high tier French, like the Richelieu, might be a bit difficult, and also the King George V and the Monarch of the British line are also similarly difficult to citadel. Americans though, especially low tier Americans, low to mid tier Americans rather, like this New Mexico, perfectly capable of citadeling them. There I didn't have quite enough penetration power, or maybe the bombs dispersed to a bad spot, hard to say. Because he's operating so close to the enemy Ryūjō, he does have a bit more fighter cover than usual. That's alright. Gonna lead it there. Not able to find quite the right angle. We're gonna try to come around for another pass. Normally I'd probably just recall, but since we're so close anyway, and we weren't able to get the citadel hit I wanted to show off, I'm gonna try again. Oh, okay, no. AA says no. Gonna launch my torpedo bombers. New Mexico is gonna drop, which means our next viable target is the Normandy. Gonna proceed closer through the gap, basically all the way into the enemy base. Victory is all but assured here. It's just about mopping up the last few stragglers. As you can see here, pretty unimpressive damage number. Don't have any dots on this because I didn't go for any fires and haven't gotten any floods yet. So the B5N is a pretty good platform. 168 knots for a tier 6 plane is not bad at all. 7,000 health on the other hand is extraordinarily squishy. This is not helped by the fact that the squadron size is overall low, so that's gonna kill him, don't need to bother. Come around and turn. We know where the Ryūjō is, and the perf has kindly lined himself up for us for some reason. He needs to turn in towards us now, he's not doing so. The drop angle is not perfect however, so we'll see if he can dodge out. He just manages to de-arm on the nose, the fighters caught that, so that is now dead. As you can see, the fighter trimmed it before I could leave, which was the expected result. The Ryūjō takes battleship AP and dies, and now it's up to us to try and get to the perf. Pop my engine cooling consumable. Haven't really used very many of mine. You can see here the cap is ticking out, so it's a bit of a race. I'm not sure I can actually beat the cap timer. No, probably not at all. It's gonna tick again, and that should finish the game. And we're too far out. It'll tick before we even touch him. But anyhow, straightforward Ryūjō game. Bit of a mini Shokaku in a sense. The hull is very similar as well. Nice cruiser speed, but lightly armored. But yeah, nothing exciting. But that is tier 6 carriers. They're not exciting, but they're not bad either, unlike the tier 4 carriers, which personally I can't stand playing. They're just very, very hard to work with because of low payload counts, which lead to very low game impact. However, if we look at the team score, have an easy 1400 here, nothing impressive, nothing unimpressive. The enemy Ryūjō was certainly trying his best. Did get top of his team, and if you multiply his score by 1.5, You'll note his score on our team would have been about 1200, so he would have been about here. So he tried, but his team kind of bit the dust too quickly for him to have any real impact. If we go to the detailed report here, we have a nice mix of damage, some cruisers, some battleships. Not too many DDs. I did hit the Iglo once with the rockets. I went 2 passes with him, but I missed with the rockets once because, as I mentioned, the Ryūjō rockets are a bit finicky. The reticle gets nice and tight, but the fact that it's so small means that any maneuvering by the DD or you can result in your rockets spraying all over the place. That's not to say that the Japanese rockets are poor exactly. They do still have 28 millimeters of penetration, so if you go back to port here to look at the specifications, if my client would stop lagging, there we go, thank you for the Twitch drop. Now if I go to modules here, you'll see that we're using the A6M20s. And if I go to armaments, sorry about that, you'll note here that we have 28 millimeters of HE shell penetration. Sorry if you can't see that, there's some pop-ups. And a maximum rocket damage of 2200, which is essentially the same as Kaga. Because if I flicker over to Kaga here, you see the same rocket, 2200, 28. And the same 4 rockets in the payload. It's just that the maximum speed of the Kaga's A6M5s is 189, and the Ryūjō is a bit slower, coming in at 179. Again, if we look at the torpedo bombers, the B5N of Kate, 168 knots, 55 knot torpedo, 65 alpha. The next most comparable aircraft, we go over to the Kaga. The B6N Tenzin does 177 knots and has a torpedo alpha of 5400, so actually a little less. But you have to remember that the Tenzin, the Kaga's Tenzin at least, has a 4 torpedo payload. Compare against the Tier 8 Ryūjō, you see that they get a 7200 alpha torpedo that still does 55 knots and is about the same speed at 177 knots maximum speed. However, the 8 there's a big HP difference, as you can see. Set almost 1700 on the Shokakus versus the rather fragile 1247. Now if I compare to the Ranger, so remember we do about 170 knots in the Japanese carrier. If you compare to the Ranger, we have the same squadron size, 6, slightly tankier planes at 1360 versus about 1250. However, our planes are some 20 knots faster, 151 versus 170. Our torpedoes are definitely faster, 40 knots versus 55, and the torpedo alpha is higher by 1000. So this is the Japanese superiority in the torpedo. But obviously if you go back to the Wildcats, you can see here the Wildcats are actually able to match us in speed. The rocket alpha is a little lower at 1900, and the HE shell penetration is slightly lower at 27. 27 is only relevant versus, I think, 2 ships in the matchmaking bracket. The Baltimore, the Prince Eugen / Shipper. Because those ships have 27mm plating, which means that the Ryūjō rockets with 28mm of penetration will beat it, but the 27mm rockets on the Ranger won't. That's hardly relevant, but even though the alpha is only 1900, so 300 less, there's 2 extra rockets, so the overall alpha of the Ranger with rockets is higher. But yeah, overall she's a typical Japanese carrier, so compared to the Americans, planes slightly squishier, but also slightly faster. I'm surprised that the Zero is essentially the same speed. The torpedo bombers are a good 20 knots faster though. And we come to the Susei, extremely squishy, 1100. In terms of hit points, speed is fine, 177 knots with speed boost, and then 61,000 alpha. But yeah, overall, Ryūjō, pretty decent platform. Kind of teaches you what to expect from the Japanese carriers, but it's really at the Shokaku that I've demonstrated several times on the channel now that the line really starts to shine. So work through the Ryūjō, she'll teach you what you need to know, and when you get to the Shokaku, boy is the reward worth it. And there you have it. Tier 6 Japanese carrier Ryūjō. Hope you enjoyed.